December 10th, celebrated as Human Rights Day around the world. And on this important day, I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on human rights in El Salvador. It has been almost 3 years since the government of El Salvador, responding to an explosion of gang violence, imposed a nationwide state of exception that suspended constitutional guarantees and fundamental rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and association. In September 2022, this commission held a hearing on the human rights consequences of that state of exception. At that point, the state of exception had already been renewed several times, and we were already seeing mass detentions without any due process. We urged an approach to combating gang violence that did not entail simply stripping Salvadoran citizens of their basic rights. Today, we are here again to raise the same concerns and more. No one, absolutely no one, disputes that the Salvadoran government was and is obligated to respond to gang violence. The first substantive right listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. But states also have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of their citizens. This obligation is not something imposed by outside actors. El Salvador has voluntarily ratified virtually every major international human rights treaty. On December 6th, the state of exception was renewed for the 33rd time through January 5th. Even if it is not renewed in the future, many of its provisions have been written into law. More than 83,000 people have been detained under the state of exception, in excess of 1.6% of the population. El Salvador has gone from having the highest homicide rate in the world in 2015 to having the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world in 2023, a rate higher than Cuba and more than 3 times that of Nicaragua. The list of rights abuses is extensive, starting with the fact that there is no publicly accessible list of those detained. As we will hear today, human rights organizations have documented arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, torture, and denial of due process at every level. Those incarcerated are regularly denied their right to food, sanitation, and health. 265 people have died in custody or shortly after release, including 4 recently born children. Hundreds of children remain in detention. Meanwhile, it's not even clear that the statistics the government is publishing on the reduction of homicide rates are true. A former commander in the U.S. Army Special Forces took a look at the data and found that the Salvadoran government has been undercounting homicides by as much as 47%. How? By excluding bodies found in mass graves, police killings, and prison homicides. In mid-November, I traveled to El Salvador to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the assassination of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter at the hands of U.S.-trained Salvadoran security forces, and talked to people about how things were going today. What I found was an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship, quite frankly as bad as what I witnessed during the Civil War that raged from 1979 to 1992. I met with family members who sobbed as they described the moment when their sons and husbands and brothers were taken from them by security forces under the state of exception. They told me how they did their best to find out where their relatives had been taken and why, and to provide them with life-sustaining food and medicine, only to learn that they had died in custody in circumstances that have never been adequately clarified. One mother begged me to help get her remaining son out of prison before he is killed too. I met with representatives of social movements whose peaceful exercise of their rights to freedom of association and expression has earned them threats of being detained under the state of exception, thrown into prison with no guarantees whatsoever. I'm talking about unions and youth groups and peace groups, civil society advocates of all kinds. These people are not in gangs, and yet they are so threatened by the state of exception that several thought twice and 3 times about whether to take a picture with me. I met with old friends whose heroic efforts contributed to the 1992 peace accords and who are now evaluating whether they must once again go into exile. I came away stunned and deeply, deeply, deeply concerned. I know that President Bukele is popular. I have met with him many times over the years. I know he has just won re-election, even though the Constitution prohibits re-election. But I just want to say, just because a policy may be popular at a given moment doesn't make it right. And last night, the Embassy of El Salvador wrote me to say that, and I quote, only representatives of civil society organizations opposed to government will be testifying here today. Well, that's incorrect. Our witnesses are not here because they oppose the government. They are here because they support human rights in El Salvador and everywhere else, including in the United States of America, as I do, which is why I regularly call out human rights abuses in my own country. We have encouraged the embassy to submit a statement for the record, and I hope that they do so. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission recently published an extensive report on El Salvador that is full of recommendations about how to correct course and fight gang violence while protecting human rights. El Salvador's next universal periodic review is scheduled for early 2025, and I expect that many governments will be making similar recommendations. The current policy, keeping tens of thousands of people in preventative detention in terrible conditions with no end in sight, is not sustainable in any sense of the word. And I look forward to hearing our witnesses' recommendations on how the U.S. Congress can best contribute to this necessary course correction. I expect one of those recommendations will be to end reprisals against journalists who try to report on the state of exception. The Salvadoran Journalists Associations documented 165 attacks against journalists between January and September of this year. Just this week, I was contacted about the case of Monica Rodriguez, the news director of Balsamo TV in El Salvador. On December 4th, several police patrols went to her house, entered without a proper warrant, and seized all her electronics, including her cell phones. When her lawyer asked why she was being investigated, they were told her case was sealed. She fears being detained and thrown in prison with no recourse. So let me repeat what I said while I was in El Salvador, respectfully but with urgency. It's time to end reprisals against journalists and civil society and protect the freedom to dissent in El Salvador. Problems are not fixed by killing the messengers. And again, I just say, we all believe that countries and governments have an obligation to protect their people from criminal acts and gang violence. That's not what's happening here. This is well beyond that. And with that, I yield now to to the co-chair of this commission, the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be here, and I welcome our distinguished witnesses to the hearing. You know, I've been to El Salvador many, many times. One of my first trips was with the Knights of Malta in the early 1980s to deliver humanitarian assistance to people who were very much in need. I also was back as the prime author of the Child Survival Fund, which puts an emphasis on immunizations. And there were days of tranquility, a day of tranquility between the FMLN and the Duarte government that were agreed to. And tens of thousands of children were immunized against polio, diphtheria, pertussis. And I've met a few of those as adults ever since. I mean, it's just amazing that their lives were preserved, potentially from death, but also from very, very debilitating diseases, the childhood killers that was focused upon during those days of tranquility. The only shots that were being fired were shots of immunization. So El Salvador holds a very special place in my heart, has and always will. In February of this year, President Bukele was elected with over 84% of the vote, a truly impressive result and a testimony to great popular support for his government. The U.S. Department of State, Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, notes that the elections in El Salvador are free and fair, quote unquote, and that the government of El Salvador generally respected freedom of expression, including for members of the press and other media, and that the government did not restrict or disrupt access to the internet or censor online content. So the president's support, we think, is probably based, most likely, on his success in fighting violent crime. In 2018, the year before President Bukele's election, El Salvador is one of the most dangerous and violent countries in the entire world, overrun by gang violence. The murder rate in El Salvador stood at 53.1 per 100,000. Bukele fought the gangs, eventually by initiating a state of exception that suspended certain constitutional rights, mostly having to do with criminal and judicial processes, in order to round up gang members. For this, he was heavily criticized by the United States and by many international NGOs, some of which were funded by the U.S. government. In 2023, however, the murder rate stood at 2.4 per 100,000. that is, life in El Salvador was dramatically improved, becoming one of the safest countries in the world. As the U.S. Department of State states frankly, Bukele's success in crime fighting, quote, allows citizens to exercise their right to life, liberty, and security of person, and to engage in daily activities in commerce without the constant threat of violence and extortion, close quote. The support of the people of El Salvador for the president, his astonishing election and reelection, is a basic fact that everyone who believes in representative government should respect. It is also equally true that human rights and the rule of law cannot be canceled even by democratic majorities. Concerns have been raised, well-founded, by the U.S. Department of State regarding the repeated extension of the state of exception, which suspends many civil and procedural rights, denial of fair public trials, and prison conditions. Concerns have also been raised by human rights defenders, including international NGOs. I do believe that there needs to be a movement to recognize that we do not want to ever see anywhere in the world, including El Salvador, innocent people who are languishing in any prison, any time. So that needs to be focused upon, and I hope that he comes to a position where he lifts that and real reform goes forward. But again, we know with the gangs that have come here from El Salvador, the violence, the trafficking. I wrote 5 laws on combating human trafficking, including the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. I'm the prime author of it. It took 3 years to get passed. The trafficking that these gangs engage in of young women is outrageous, and that includes as they come across our border and do their heinous acts here in the United States of America. Well, that was going on in El Salvador as well. That has been largely mitigated, but again, we got to make sure that the rule of law and respect for human rights is respected. Mr. Chairman, I do have a meeting with the commander of the Joint Base in McGuire, Fort Dix, and Lakehurst. We have a situation. Last night, I was on a New Jersey beach with the Ocean County Sheriff Mastronardi for hours. Because there has been an unbelievable number of drones coming into New Jersey. Our response has been, in my humble opinion, feckless. DOD has not engaged. Department of Homeland Security has not done enough. And I was told, Mr. Chairman, by one of, and you've got to be concerned about that in Massachusetts as well, that one of our 47-foot motor lifeboats, the Coast Guard was there last night on the beach, was trailed by more than a dozen of these drones as it was making its way up and down right off the coast of where we were in Ocean County. I asked what were the rules of engagement. They don't have them yet, and that's troubling in and of itself, so I'm going to be meeting with the commander of Joint Base. I wish we would have started at 2, but those votes intervened. But I want our witnesses to know, deeply appreciate you being here.
Thank you, and good luck with your meeting.
Thank you so much.
Okay, let me introduce our distinguished panel. Leonora Arteaga Rubio is a Salvadoran attorney. She heads the program on impunity and grave human rights violations at the Due Process of Law Foundation in Washington, D.C. Noah Bullock serves as the executive director of Cristasol, a human rights organization that pursues a more just and peaceful future for El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Ana Maria Mendez Dardon is the director of Central America at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, where she leads research and advocacy on strengthening democracy, human rights, rule of law, and judicial independence. Juan Papier is the America's deputy director at Human Rights Watch, where he supervises research and advocacy efforts on several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Carlos Bernal serves as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as its rapporteur for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Paraguay, and Trinidad and Tobago. He is also the rapporteur for persons with disabilities. I thank everybody for being here, and I will yield now to Ms. Arteaga to open up. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Congressman McGovern, and also Congressman Smith, and the rest of the distinguished members of the Commission. On behalf of the Due Process of Law Foundation, I thank you for the opportunity to report on the human rights crisis that has been taking place in El Salvador since the state of exception was put in place in March 2022. Just let me begin by stating that DPLF stands with the victims of gang violence, as well as the victims of state-perpetrated violence in El Salvador and across the Americas, including all the Latin American countries where we work with civil society, governments, and the international community to promote respect for human rights and the rule of law. So the state of exception in El Salvador, as we know, was promoted as a public security policy to crack down on gangs who had terrorized the country for years. It seems that it has been effective. Crime rates have plummeted, and the crisis of gang violence appears to be over, or nearly over. More than 2.5 years later, however, it is legally and factually unjustifiable that what should have been a temporary and emergency measure is still in place. To understand why the state of exception remains in force, we must understand that while it has been sold as necessary for crime reduction and public safety, it is actually being used to maintain control of the population and generate fear among people that is in some way critics of the government authoritarian trends. It has set a dangerous precedent, signaling that is acceptable or in some way acceptable and indeed essential for a government to eliminate human rights protections in the name of public security. And it has created, the state of exception, a framework for the systematic commission of human rights abuses, which has been well documented by Salvadorian and international organizations such as those here today. Since the state of the exception took effect, we have seen an increase in militarizations, particularly in marginalized communities, formerly dominated by gangs, as well as the construction of a mega prison and other concerning measures. We know that more than 82 people have been arrested, some of them for very, not well-sustained charges, just for having tattoos, wearing the wrong cap, or living in a poor neighborhood. Nearly 300 of those detainees have died while in custody, while in prisons. It is likely that some of those deaths can be classified as extrajudicial killings under international law. That is, the deliberate killing of individuals outside any legal framework. It is also likely that some of the torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial executions that have been documented may constitute crime against humanity, which implies the existence of a plan or a policy to commit them, involving a chain of command of government actors. In El Salvador, if crimes against humanity are being committed, it is probably that they are being ordered, or at least with the knowledge of senior government officials, including President Nayib Bukele himself. Also, the state of exception occurs within an increasingly authoritarian context, as we all know, where President Bukele has successfully consolidated executive power. But to be clear, the current scenario was not created exclusively by the executive. The judiciary has played a key role in facilitating the abuses that are taking place under the state of exception. Due process and the presumption of innocence have been all but eliminated by those detained under this policy, with prosecutors and judges failing to question these practices, even though they have a duty to do so. When people are arrested, it is not uncommon for them to be brought before judges in group hearings without any due process guarantees. At the same time, there has been a series of legal reform to facilitate harsher penalties and fewer protections for detainees, reforms to the penal code and the special law against act of terrorism against others. This group of reforms allowed for expedited proceedings to prove gang participations, increased sentences for gang-related convictions, and permitted children as young as 12 accused of gang memberships to be tried as adults. These reforms are anti-democratic, and as they do away with the rights and protections that we're all entitled in a judicial process. The situation in El Salvador has also raised alarm at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The Inter-American Commission published a solid and thorough report about the human rights situation in El Salvador under the emergency regime, which detailed violations, including those against children and mass-scale illegal and arbitrary detentions, abuses in the use of force, and due process violation. We are grateful to the Commission, represented here today, for centering the voices of victims, listening to civil society, and playing a vital role in holding governments in the region accountable to human rights standards, including El Salvador. There are no easy answers when it comes to addressing this scenario in El Salvador. There are, however, some things that can and should be done. Among the immediate necessary steps to reestablish due process, in addition to revoking the state of exception, it is one, the revision of the legal cases of those detained under the state of exception by some kind of experts, commission of experts, to analyze legal alternatives and at some point to order the immediate liberation of those who should not be incarcerated, along the lines of the Innocent Project that we know here in the US. At the same time, avenue for international accountability should be pursued, including an international criminal investigation into potential crimes against humanity, whether in a third country or before the Inter-American Criminal Court, as well as a possible UN fact-finding mission to investigate and document what is occurring in El Salvador. So thank you again, Congressman McGovern, for your commitment to the Salvadorian people, and thank you to the Commission again for this time today. I look forward for your questions.
Thank you very much. Noah Bullock.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Commission and the co-chairs of the Commission for this opportunity. We're Crystal Sal, we're deeply sympathetic to the situation of victims of gangs, as was mentioned in the opening remarks of one of the chairs. Our organization has assisted thousands of victims of internal displacement, mostly by gangs and narco-trafficking groups in the region over the years. But today we're here with the concern about many of those same victims, groups of people and communities that were victims of gangs, who now find themselves victims of abuses of power under the state of exception. As this hearing is in session, hundreds of family members, mostly mothers, sisters, and wives of innocent Salvadorans arbitrarily detained during the state of exception are on their second day of a march from El Salvador's Pacific coast to the executive office of the president in the capital. Their objective is to demand freedom for their innocent relatives detained during the state of exception, and that the Salvadoran government respect their right to visit family members so that they can confirm that their loved ones are still alive after more than 2 years of prison. Since the beginning of the state of exception in March of 2022, Crystal Sal has documented over 3,500 complaints of arbitrary detention. Our forensic investigative team has confirmed with photographic, documentary, and testimonial evidence the deaths of 320 prisoners caused by acts of torture. Our legal team has analyzed 1,178 cases of detentions during the state of exception to assess the legality of the detention and the criminal proceedings brought by the state. In 100% of the cases studied, we found no legal basis to justify the detentions and no individualized evidence to substantiate the criminal case against the accused. In a study currently underway, Crystal Sal has confirmed that in a sample of 131 cases, 115 family cases, family members of detainees have not received any information to confirm the whereabouts or well-being of their relatives since they were captured. The situation constitutes forced disappearance according to international standards. Due to reforms to the penal code and judicial procedures, people detained in the state of exception can be held for at least 4 years before trial. Crystal Sal's experience in exercising a legal defense for detainees with physical and mental handicaps and chronic illness demonstrate a systematic negation of the most minimal due process rights and a failure of the justice system to act independently and protect rights. There is little doubt that the Salvadoran government has now unchecked power to detain and hold indefinitely anyone that it likes. And there is no public institution in the country with sufficient independence to intervene in the protection of rights. This situation has created a generalized climate of intimidation and fear for the exercise of political rights and to the detriment of the democratic life of the country. Public opinion polls show that 65% of Salvadorans fear talking about politics. 53.9% maintain that they feel some level of fear for receiving any type of intimidation or threat from expressing themselves on any matter of national importance or about the decisions the current government is taking. In February of 2024, Salvadorans went to the polls under the state of exception for the first time since the military dictatorships. Cristosal verified and monitored the militarization of 13 communities, including polling stations, in the weeks leading up to the elections. Community members reported to Cristosal mass detentions conducted by police and soldiers, going door to door with lists of names and quotas for captures. In one village, 8 people with no links to gangs were captured, 2 of them being elected members of the Community Development Association, known as ADESCOs. In a meeting with members of a youth coalition from the Department of Morazan, one youth leader told Cristosal, "I was born in a refugee camp. Community organizing is part of our identity and survival. But under the state of exception, community organization is persecuted. In communities with long traditions of community organizing, they have been subjected to militarization and mass detentions. Many of them are marching today. In Bajo Lempo Usulutan, for example, Cristosal has confirmed 134 detentions of community members. In Guajira Chalatenango, 5 community members were detained while thousands of soldiers occupied the village between the presidential and legislative elections, including leaders of a community development organization known as Asociación El Tamarindo. In Cristosal's recent report on closing civic space, 99.2% of the 128 organizations interviewed reported at least one violation of civil or political rights. 86% of the organizations reported that they have reverted to self-censorship to avoid attacks. 6.5% report that one or more of their members have had to leave the country because of harassment and threats. In the wake of recent marches of medical personnel and teachers in November, Cristosal has confirmed 139 people were fired for their participation in the march. Labor unions in El Salvador have registered more than 20 labor leaders detained in the state of exception, and at least one of those has died in custody. Cristosal has also documented the detentions of human rights defenders under the state of exception. Dina Hernandez is a community leader and human rights defender who volunteers in violence prevention programs and youth organizations that promote women's rights in the municipality of Ayuxtepeque. She is a volunteer teacher at a community association that provides rehabilitation and social integration for people with disabilities. She's also the co-founder of the Raquel Alert Collective that helps families of the disappeared search for their relatives. Dina was 35 weeks pregnant when the National Civilian Police arrested her while she was walking home with a 5-year-old son in March of this year. Her daughter was born in prison, and on April 7th, Dina's family was notified by authorities that Dina's baby had died. Cristosal has verified the death of 4 newborn children to mothers who were incarcerated during the state of exception. Dina's family does not currently have communication with her or have knowledge of her whereabouts or well-being. She has not been released to her family despite 2 judicial orders for her release. Salvadoran prison authorities have detained her illegally for 102 days in violation of a direct court order. In recent days, Cristosal has documented and denounced publicly an escalation of harassment and persecution of our staff and close collaborators. After the implementation of a series of community fairs using art to raise awareness about transparency, a social communicator was illegally detained and interrogated for hours about his involvement with Cristosal by police officers. Last week, as Congressman McGovern mentioned, our journalist from a community radio station that hosts a weekly radio program with Cristosal on human rights had her house searched by agents of the National Civilian Police and the Attorney General. Her computers and phones were confiscated, and no explanation was given as to the motive of the search and seizure. Similarly, last week, a graphic design artist who donates work to Cristosal had his house searched and his equipment and phone seized. It has been made public that the police maintains files on political opposition, human rights defenders, and civic leaders, including Crystal South staff. I want to thank again the Commission for the time I cede my space.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Ana Maria Mendez Dardon.
Chairman McGovern and Smith, thank you for calling this hearing, and it's an honor to be with you today. I'm going to talk about the state of the judicial system in El Salvador, which today lacks independence and has failed to provide justice for Salvadorian citizens, and how this impacts the search for justice for cases for gross human rights violations committed during the country's civil war. A cornerstone of any democracy is the separation of powers, but President Bukele has eroded the system of check and balances by different measures, including blocking the access of public information and threatening members of the judiciary. Bukele concentrates power and has control over the judiciary and legislative branch, where his party, Nuevas Ideas, has a supermajority of 54 seats out of 60. He ran for a second term in 2022 despite a clear constitutional ban for a consecutive reelection. Recently, the Legislative Assembly elected 2/3 of magistrates for the Supreme Court in a process that lacked transparency, citizen participation, or technical evaluations as required by national and international standards. The legislative process in general, as well as the election of judicial officials, takes place without any debate, discussion, or citizen participation, which is a serious threat to the standards of a democratic state. Why does this matter? Because the cooptation of the justice system poses a threat to democracy itself. Good security measures should be accompanied by an efficient, independent justice system, which unfortunately has become, as was exposed here, as a repressive criminalization tool, unable to address structural impunity. The vast majority of gross human rights violations committed during the Civil War remain in complete impunity. Since 2021, when Bukele called the peace accords a farce, there has been a series of setbacks in transitional justice cases that were documented by the country's Truth Commission. For example, the 1999 murder of the 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter has never really moved forward. Although the case was reopened, this was done not by a desire of justice, but by the government's eagerness to prosecute former President Alfredo Cristiani, who is seen as a political opponent of Bukele and a symbol of the Arena Party. The El Mozote case, in which over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children, were executed by Salvadorian troops in December 1991, is now stalled because of the armed forces' refusal to share documents, as well as the dismissal in 2021 of George Guzman, who had presided over the case for years. Now he lives in exile. To facilitate access to justice for these and other historic cases of grave human rights violations, the U.S. government should work to continue declassify U.S. documents from the Civil War, such as U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence records. At the same time, given the current concentration of power and lack of judicial independence, the U.S. government should place a greater emphasis on respecting and strengthening the democratic institutions in its bilateral relations with the Salvadorian government. An upcoming opportunity will be in January 2025, when the Legislative Assembly must elect a new Attorney General, as this role is essential for effective criminal investigations and access to justice. The U.S. should also call on the Bukele government to make available public information related to the state of human rights, women's rights, citizen security measures, and even the reality of gun-related violence, as lack of government data is making it very difficult for WOLA and the broader international community to get information on what is truly occurring in El Salvador. Pursuing historic cases of human rights violations is not an issue of vengeance, but a healing wounds from the past that continue to damage El Salvador today. The ability to move forward with these cases will be a true test of the impartiality and the effectiveness of the country's judicial system to bring justice to victims, not just of past human rights violations, but present human rights violations. I just wanted to finalize this with what Monsignor Romero said once, and he said, "Peace is not the product of terror or fear. Peace is not the silence of cemeteries. Peace is not the silent result of violent repression. Peace is the generous, tranquil contribution of all to the good of all. Peace is dynamism. Peace is generosity. It is right and it is duty." Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn to Juan Papier.
Chair McGovern, thank you for the invitation to appear before this commission to testify on the human rights situation in El Salvador during the ongoing state of emergency. For years, El Salvador has struggled with endemic gang violence perpetrated by groups like MS-13 and Barrio 18. These criminal organizations have terrorized communities through extortion, murder, child recruitment, and other atrocious crimes. As Human Rights Watch has documented, previous administrations repeatedly failed to effectively address this violence and to protect Salvadorians' rights to life and physical integrity. In March 2022, President Nayib Bukele's administration declared a war on gangs following an unprecedented wave of violence in the country. His supporters in the Legislative Assembly passed a state of emergency which remains in place. Since, security forces have conducted hundreds of indiscriminate raids and report arresting over 83,000 people. Homicide rates have dropped, and in interviews across the country, people report feeling safer from gang-related violence. At the same time, security forces have committed widespread human rights violations. Human Rights Watch recent investigation, Your Child Does Not Exist Here, documents human rights violations specifically against children aged 12 to 17 during the state of emergency. Human Rights Watch researchers visited San Salvador, Sonsonate, and Cuscatlán states. We reviewed official records and interviewed over 90 people, including victims of abuse, judges, police officers, teachers, amongst others. We also repeatedly requested information from the government, which in most cases did not provide a substantive response. We documented dozens of arbitrary arrests of children, both boys and girls. Many arrests appear to be based on the detainees' appearance or anonymous complaints rather than on credible evidence. Police officers told Human Rights Watch that some of the arrests are driven by a policy of quotas requiring officers to arrest a certain number of people per day. These arbitrary arrests especially impact youth from communities already affected by poverty and social exclusion, many of whom, as we document in the report, were previously victims of gang violence themselves. Our report also documents cases of torture and inhumane treatment, including burnings, beatings, suffocation, and mock execution against children. We also documented cases where children were punished for another detainee's behavior, a collective punishment in violation of international human rights law. Authorities in El Salvador have failed to protect detained children from violence by other detainees, including credible report of sexual abuse occurring in the detention sites. Children held in these detention facilities in 2022 and 2023 reported appalling conditions, including often overcrowded and unsanitary cells, inadequate nutrition food, lack of or denial of access to medication, medical care, and education. In some cases, they were held in cells alongside adults. The government and other sources claim that prison conditions in juvenile detention centers have progressively improved, in part due to efforts by humanitarian organizations and foreign embassies. However, the government has effectively denied Human Rights Watch's request to visit the centers, despite an initial proposal by the government that our researchers verify conditions there. Children have also been subjected to serious due process violations and unfair trials. Court records show that many have been sentenced solely on the basis of uncorroborated police statements or have been abusively pressed to plead guilty in groups. The latest official figures from January 2024 indicate that 841 children remain in detention out of more than 3,000 who have been detained during the state of emergency. These include 262 children who were awaiting trial and more than 500 who were serving sentences. However, many of the children released continue to suffer stigmatization by members of security forces who threaten with arresting them arbitrarily again. There are no indications that the government of El Salvador is holding security officers accountable for these and other abuses committed during the state of emergency. In a letter sent to Human Rights Watch following the release of our report, the government refused to investigate the cases we documented. Simultaneously, authorities have so far failed to ensure any meaningful accountability for the atrocities committed by gangs in El Salvador. This Congress and the U.S. government can take effective action to promote effective and rights-respecting security policies to address gang violence in El Salvador. Congress should condition any funding to Salvadorian government entities implicated in abuses, including police and the military, on specific steps to prevent and investigate rights abuses. The U.S. government should also increase support for independent media outlets and civil society groups who play a critical role promoting democracy and human rights in El Salvador. This Congress and the U.S. government should also urge Salvadorian authorities to create a review mechanism for detention cases occurring during the state of emergency to ensure the release of people, including children who were arbitrarily detained. The Salvadorian government should shift its focus towards holding to account higher-level gang leaders and other perpetrators of violent crimes. Salvadorians should not be forced to choose between security and other fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Carlos Bernal.
Thank you, Congressman. I would like to begin thanking for the invitation to this hearing. As a commissioner and country rapporteur for El Salvador at the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this hearing and share relevant remarks about the Commission's report, and I quote, "State of Emergency and Human Rights in El Salvador." This report is based on information provided by civil society and the Salvadorian state, assessed with fairness, technical expertise, and objectivity, and based on the Inter-American human rights standards. Several years of continuous bloodshed and the construction of the state produced by gangs violence led to thousands of victims. With that time frame, which began in the 90s, between March 24 and 27 of 2002, El Salvador experienced a sudden spike in homicides across various regions of the country. This spike, which resulted in at least 92 deaths, was the tip of an iceberg of continuous human rights violations, lack of enjoyment of freedoms and security by the citizens, and institutionalized corruption and state neglect of their population. In response, the President and the Congress declared a state of emergency, suspending several constitutional rights and guarantees, including the rights not to be compelled to testify, the 22-hour limit for administrative detention, and the inviolability of correspondence and telecommunications. Within this background, the Commission prepared a special report for El Salvador. For that purpose, the Commission collected information through public hearings, meetings with civil society organizations, interviews with alleged victims of human rights violations under the state of emergency, and incorporated information provided by the state, civil society organizations, press reports, as well as decisions and recommendations from specialized international organizations. On September the 4th, 2024, the Commission published the report. Personally, and along another commissioner, we issue a partial dissent to the report. We disagree with the lack of evidence of some of the conclusions achieved by the Commission and with some other methodological matters. Furthermore, we flag that some of the information that the Commission used for the report was provided by a civil society organization that received funding from foundations that also fund the Commission. From our perspective, this creates a conflict of interest that the Commission should have avoided. In any event, the report, the Commission recognized a significant improvement in citizen security in El Salvador. On the other hand, the Commission acknowledged the several violations of human rights caused by gang activities. Therefore, the report has an entire section on the criminal actions on the gangs. Gangs are a highly complex and regional phenomenon that the state failed to address during more than 3 decades. Gangs activities and the neglect by the state led to violence on vulnerable populations, especially women and girls. Moreover, violence deprived the poorest from many rights, including life, freedom, justice, and the ability to aspire to a life free from violence. This situation made enjoying simple things like playing, going to school, or working peacefully unattainable. In contrast, and as a personal note, during a recent visit to El Salvador, I observed the country's newfound safety. I visited the capital's downtown, once a gang territory, and spoke with waiters and taxi drivers who appreciated the security they now enjoy. In addition, the Commission acknowledges a historic debt of reparation for gang victims and their families. Beyond the report, public information available in the media revealed that the reduction of gangs activity has reduced crime rates, in particular homicide rates, to historical lows. This has also been an economic driver. Salvadorians went back to their economic activities. Foreign investment has increased, especially in areas such as energy, construction, technology, infrastructure, and tourism. Furthermore, social benefits of the security policy are the return of the people to their homes previously taken by gang members, the improvement of transport system, and the resurgence of a new generation of youth who can be educated in an environment of freedom, security, and peace. On the other hand, in the report, the Commission emphasized that the state of emergency and the measures that the authorities take under this framework ought to align with international human rights obligations. Regarding the suspension of guarantees within the context of a state of emergency, the Inter-American human rights bodies have established that such a measure can only be exceptional and must adhere to the principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, and reasonableness. In this scenario, the Commission observed that the suspension of certain constitutional provisions was not necessary. Furthermore, the Commission recommended the state to guarantee all the dimensions of due process under the American Convention. Finally, the Commission suggested that a progressive restoration of all rights should be achieved at the pace of improvement in public safety. Concerning due process, the Commission expressed its concern about some legislative changes involving mandatory application of pretrial detention for certain offenses, the withholding of identity of justice operator in criminal proceedings, and the imposition of adult prison sentence to minors. Moreover, the Commission received information from civil society sources about incidents of illegal arrest, the use of discriminatory criteria, violence, excessive force, and violation of privacy in the arrests. The Commission also received information about the limitations on the exercise of judicial guarantees and the defense of the accused, such as the lack of effectiveness of the habeas corpus and the holding of mass hearings. Concerning the situation of persons deprived of liberty, the Commission received information about overcrowding in both police stations and prison systems, with all the human rights impacts that overcrowding generates. Finally, the Commission also received information regarding certain incidents involving death, allegation of torture and ill treatment of detainees, abuses in the use of disciplinary measures, and the use of force against detainees, as well as deficiencies or omissions in mechanisms for reporting and investigating these incidents. In accordance with Article 41B of the American Convention on Human Rights, the Commission formulated 22 recommendations to the state of El Salvador. Among the most notable recommendations are the following: put an end to the suspension of rights and guarantees restricted under the state of emergency, develop a comprehensive public policy on citizen security with a focus on human rights and civil society participation, implement a policy for supporting victims of crimes perpetrated by gangs with their participation, develop a registry of identity to identify the victims of human rights violations committed under the state of emergency, along with a comprehensive preparation plan, adapt a criminal and criminal procedure legislation, particularly by repealing the mandatory application of preventive detention provisions that allow for the confidentiality of the identity of justice operators, and provisions that enable the application of adult prison sentence to individuals under 18 years of age. Maintaining a system for registering the total number of persons deprived of liberty, and granting approval for a working visit by the Commission. As a rapporteur for El Salvador, I should acknowledge the willingness of the state of El Salvador to engage with the Commission in constant dialogue and to implement its recommendations. First, the state has timely replied to all my letters requesting information about general human rights issues and particular violations and incidents. Second, I have held several meetings in the headquarters of the Commission with the highest rank officials of El Salvador human rights diplomacy to discuss concerns by the Commission. Third, in my recent visit to El Salvador, state authority informed me that they are preparing a report to the Commission in which they will say that they are already implementing some of the recommendations issued by the Commission in its report. They include the creation of a program of permanent human rights training for judicial operators, the National Police Force, the armed forces, educational programs for youth which have been involved in illegal activities, and ensuring minimum detention conditions, including shelter, hygiene, food, potable water, and medical access with a gender and risk group perspective. I would like to finish this statement by reaffirming my commitment and the commitment of all the Commission to use all diplomatic and quasi-judicial instruments and monitoring instruments that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission can display to guarantee the human rights of the people of El Salvador. I hope that the Commission, or at least several commissioners, can undertake a country visit in 2025. I can also hope that the progressive control of the gangs can lead to the end of the state of emergency. Constitutional law professors know that the enormity of the abnormality is what justifies the state of emergency. The positive outlook of the current situation in El Salvador concerning security is a signal of the reduction of the enormity of the abnormality. If this forecast is correct, I'm confident that we will see very soon the end of the state of emergency and the entrenchment for the first time of a constitutional democracy in that country after the horrific era of gangs violence. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bernal, and I hope you're right, because for quite some time now I've been told that the state of emergency was going to end, in the immediate future, and it hasn't. So I hope that you know something that that we don't know. But I just for the record, do you disagree with recommendations issued in the Inter-American Commission's Human Rights Report?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
My disagreement was just only on the two matters concerning
so you-
methodology
So you agree with the recommendations in the report? Okay, that's helpful. I'm going to ask a few questions here, and then, so I'm going to be going all around so just be patient with me. Ms. Arteaga, you concluded your testimony by saying that there are no easy solutions when it comes to addressing the current scenario in El Salvador, but there are some things that can and should be done. What would be the top 3 recommendations for steps to take to respond to the human rights concerns that have been brought about by the state of exception?
Well, the first one is revoking the state of exception. I think we all agree that this temporary measure is not needed anymore in El Salvador, and it also one of the recommendations coming from the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the state of exception should end, right? Legally speaking. The second thing, and I think that we agree with Human Rights Watch, is that some kind of review mechanism should be created. Review mechanism for all the people that are detained, because there are massive detentions and there are different kind of cases. So some kind of review mechanism, commission of experts should look at all the cases and propose different legal alternatives, especially for people that could be innocent, right? And I was mentioning that here in the U.S. we all know like the Innocent Project or something like that, right? I cannot talk about wrongful convictions because there hasn't been any convictions in El Salvador so far, people detained during the state of exception, but it's something like that. And the third recommendation is that we need to look at what's going on in El Salvador through the lens of international criminal law. So probably what we're seeing is not only human rights abuses, but also international crimes, or crimes against humanity. So that involves systematic abuses, but also it involves policies, practices, chain of command, and I think that it's important to look at what's happening in El Salvador, not just isolated human rights violation, and it's important to explore international criminal accountability avenues.
Yeah. So you mentioned the special law against acts of terrorism, and can you just say a little bit more about what that law does, and has gang activity been conflated with terrorism in the Salvadoran legal code?
That law was created that was created many years ago, and the idea was to use that law for gang members, right? But so far, that law hasn't been really applied or used in the cases around the state of exception. All the people that is being tried, or most people that is being tried under the state of exception, is actually being tried by a criminal association. I think that's the name. Criminal association. That's the crime. So it hasn't really been used. Not that any of the terrorism standards has been used for the state of exception cases so far.
And how much of the state of exception has been written into law? So I ask that because if it were lifted tomorrow, how much, if anything, would change?
The state of exception itself is a very short decree that is being renewed every month by the Salvadorian Congress. So if it is not renewed again, it will actually won't change that much, legally speaking. But it's important in terms of that is not a human rights measure. That should not be renewed again. The problem is that all the lack of due process, it won't go away just by revoking the state of exception itself. because of the legal reforms. The legal reforms are very concerning. Also, the Inter-American Human Rights System talked about that in its report. There are at least 3 important points that are not according to the international standards. One is that the minimum legal age for trying adolescents, and now the minimum legal age is 12, and it should be at least 14. The other thing is that the pretrial detention now is indefinite, and it's basically automatic pretrial detention, and also what else? And the other thing is not just legal reforms, but the judicial practices. Judges that were created for the state of exception are judges that have their identity reserved. And basically, it's like a secret justice system that nobody really knows what's happening there. And so one thing is one thing should be revoking the state of exception, then reforming or the criminal code and all the reforms that were put in place after the state of exception, and third, review the judicial practices and the cases.
Right. And let me just say to everybody, if I ask a question that you want to add to, just raise your hand or interrupt me. Mr. Bullock, let me just say one other thing about our recent trip and about the state of exception that really I found to be particularly troublesome, and that is for a lot of the family members whose loved ones have been apprehended, again, without charge, them not knowing where they are. I mean, in some cases, bringing food and bringing letters and, to a particular place where they think that their son or their brother or their father might be, and not being able to be told, yeah, they're here. And the inability of anybody who's been apprehended to be able to notify their family that they're there. I guess the counter would be that, well, if they're gang members, they could be sending messages or something like that. But I mean, like, even just a postcard that could be reviewed by the prison officials simply saying, I'm alive, I'm here. I found that particularly heartbreaking, talking to families who were not even given the satisfaction of being able to be told that their child is alive, or that they're being held at a particular place, or even being told in any detail why they were being apprehended. I met with many families including some whose kids died, who don't even understand why their son was taken to begin with. I mean, that it's just like, and let me also state for the record, I think we all believe that gang violence is awful, terrible, unacceptable. I think we all can say that previous administrations in El Salvador didn't do enough to combat gang violence. I don't think there's any question about that. But what I witnessed was something that goes beyond being focused on gang violence. Mr. Bullock, I understand that during a recent visit to Costa Rica, President Bukele mentioned Cristasol and other human rights organizations by name. For the record, can you tell us what happened and what the implications are for you and for your work and and the work of your colleagues?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman McGovern. I just would add to your comments. I was with the families, the hundreds of people who were walking to the president's office this morning, and I was talking with one mother who went to a prison. I asked her when the last time she saw her son was, and she said that in the first months of the state of exception, she went with her son's daughter, who she now has to take care of, to bring food and clothing, medicine to the prison. And she heard her son yelling from his prison cell from the second story. That was the last time she heard his voice or had any confirmation that he was alive. I think afterwards they moved him or made it impossible for prisoners to communicate in that way. I think as we think about recommendations, there's no need to wait. The family members are marching today asking for family visits. It's a way of making the prison system marginally transparent to be able to confirm the well-being, the lives, and if people are receiving the packages that family members diligently bring on a monthly basis. The president's remarks in Costa Rica, I don't recall exactly what he said, but generally they are similar to some of the remarks we've heard today about Crystal Sal and the methodologies that we've used to produce reports. I am grateful to Commissioner Bernal for being with us and to dialogue. I hope we can meet with him the next time he's in El Salvador to show the evidence. He can meet with victims and we can show him the methodologies as well. But in general, it's important to be able to recognize when we hear messages whose intent are to attack and delegitimize the voice of the victims and human rights defenders. And part of those messages are to focus, when we bring evidence forward about torture, about forced disappearances, about killings, about arbitrary detention, to then say, but the gangs also created victims. It's part of a narrative construction in which, in the propaganda apparatus of the Salvadoran government, human rights defenders are defenders of gangs themselves. It's a way to attack us and not discuss the evidence that we bring forward. So I think it's important to be able to recognize those things because those messages are part of what undermines a democratic society and culture, to criminalize people who dissent in critical voices rather than dialogue, frankly, about the information being discussed. I mentioned at the end of my comments a concern about escalation of harassment towards Crystal Sal, but we're not alone. In our recent report about closing civic space, I mentioned some of the statistics, but for people and leaders in community, the fear for being critical, for proposing, for participating in some way in the social, economic, and political life of the country without being aligned with government positions is to suffer some sort of consequence in El Salvador. And the greatest consequence right now is to be disappeared in prisons after a detention in the state of exception.
And you mentioned that it is public, that the police maintain files on the political opposition, human rights defenders, and civic leaders. Is this something that journalists have uncovered? I mean, is there information on this that we should include in the hearing record?
Yeah, it was information that was leaked to journalists, and we were able to solicit the database to see if some of our staff have been part of that registry. You see in the files on some of the people language that's reminiscent of the 80s, like this person is part of a apparatus of the political opposition. It uses a front of like transparency or human rights issues to attack the government. Again, I think it's a misunderstanding of the role of human rights organizations in the country. We are defending the constitutional democracy and the rights of people, not necessarily taking a position about political parties.
Ms. Mendez-Dardon, in your testimony, you summarized the lack of progress in the El Mozote case, which is a case that some of us have been following for some time, and mentioned that the United States should continue to declassify documents from the war. Maybe you could explain to us why declassification is important in that case, and what information do you believe could be contained in U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence records that would be relevant here?
It's a very hard question, but I think that we all know that, unfortunately, during the armed conflicts in Central America, not just in El Salvador, but also in Guatemala, the U.S. government play a key role in providing assistance, financial assistance, and military assistance for the militaries in countries in Central America, which are responsible of gross human rights violations. So I think it's important for the U.S. To acknowledge and recognize this type of like bad intervention that has had in the past in these countries, and to work with victims, because the truth commissions in these countries, particularly in El Salvador, as I mentioned it, they have documented all these violations. And also it is important to know that we also went to El Salvador recently, and when you speak with the victims, they're still there seeking for justice. They're still there, and I think that the U.S. can also, besides declassifying documents, which is an important tool in order to look at what were like the conditions of these human rights violations, the perpetrators, and so on. The U.S. Could also support and ask for the Salvadorian government to create special units within the Attorney General's office to investigate and prosecute these cases. Unfortunately, as I mentioned it in my testimony, the lack of judicial independence is a huge problem in El Salvador. He concentrates power, he has control over the judiciary, who, for instance, in the case of the El Mozote, they have been trying to block any progress for this case. So yes, I think these two areas, declassifying and also supporting or pursuing or ask to the El Salvadorian government to work with these units.
Yeah, I don't understand why the United States, why it's so difficult to get all these records declassified. I opened up by saying I was in El Salvador for the 35th anniversary of the commemoration of the murder of the Jesuit priest. There are still documents we're trying to get declassified by our government. That's a case that's personal to me because I was the aide that helped investigate that murder way back when. But El Mozote was 1981, right? Am I right? 81? That's a long time ago. Yeah, I mean, I'll go. Yeah, you go ahead.
Just to complement on what Ana Maria said, that I think that in El Mozote case, which we are commemorating the 43 anniversary today of this massacre. On one hand, it's important that the case move forward to the final stage, right, to sentencing. We need to remember that El Salvador is the only country in Latin America that went through authoritarian regimes in the past decades that has nobody no convictions at all for the past atrocities. And the case of El Mozote is ready for going to sentencing. Cristosal is representing victim in El Salvador, and the case is very strong in terms of evidence and should be at some point.
I agree. But I'm just making the case.
On the other hand, and declassified information from the U.S. in previous years have been very important in El Mozote case. At some point, this declassified information became evidence through expert witnesses, as the one coming from the Professor Terry Carl. But at the same time, it's important to keep opening declassified information on one hand for truth purposes, for symbolic purposes, and on the other hand, because there are more cases regarding the armed conflict that needs more declassified information. I know there's been some motions coming from experts here in the USA, as the work from Washington universities in Seattle, and other efforts. I know that there are still so many years later, I don't know, not enough will here and in El Salvador to open all the archives.
Well, I think we ought to make another push for that. I mean, the reason why I say that is because when the Jesuits were murdered, the official reaction from our government was that they were murdered by the FMLN. And I can go through a whole bunch of instances where the initial reaction by my government, our government, was denial. Same thing in El Mozote for many, many years. And it was a massacre of, you know, with, yeah, I mean, how many deaths was it? How many people, over 1,000 people? A lot of children were killed. I mean, you know, I mean, we need to do better. Mr. Papia, I don't know, did you want to add something to this? Or let me you recommend the creation of a review mechanism for cases of detention that have occurred under the state of exception. What would that look like, and how would it work?
Thank you, Congressman. There are two situations happening today in the justice system in El Salvador. On the one hand, we have an important number of people who have been detained arbitrarily, people who have no connection to gangs and who are serving time in prison for essentially for no reason. And at the same time, we have zero accountability for victims of gangs. The senior leaders of the gangs have not been held to account. There have been no sentences against adult members of the gangs since the state of emergency was passed. There have been sentences only against minors. And I may add as well that 3 senior leaders of MS-13 had fled prison, were found later and extradited to the United States by other authorities. There are 8 extraditions to the United States that have been stopped by the Supreme Court, controlled by Bukele, and several others pending. 4 extraditions that have been stopped by the Supreme Court and 8 others pending. So there has been no accountability for the abuses committed by the gangs, and there are a whole lot of innocent people in jail. So what we suggest, and I think DPLF has indicated something similar, is create a mechanism so that we can release the innocent people in jail, decrease the pressure on the justice system so that they can prioritize the cases that are most important, prioritize prosecuting the senior gang leaders, prioritize prosecuting those most responsible for the atrocities that MS-13 and Barrio 18 have committed.
You go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add something on that. When Bukele met with President Chavez in Costa Rica, he recognized that over 8,000 of people were innocent. They were detained are innocent. So that's why it's very important to have also access to information, because how, like, as international organizations or even the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights needs to have access to this information, to visit the country, to visit the prisons, to know the reality and not just the information that came controlled by the government.
Thank you. And let me ask Mr. Burnell a question, then I'll yield to my colleague, Ms. Omar, who's here. You had asserted in your opening statement that there was a conflict of interest on the part of the Inter-American Commission because it accepted information from an organization that receives funding from the same foundations that fund the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I'm summarizing that correctly, right?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. And did you examine the funding of every organization or entity that submitted information to the Commission and compare it to sources of funding for the Commission?
Actually, no, but in this case, this was an argument that was brought to the table by the state. And then as a rapporteur, my proposal was the following, is that if we are able to find the same information from another source, we can put it in the report. Okay. But in many instances, this was not possible. So for this reason, to avoid conflict of interest, that can take legitimacy from the report. I dissented concerning that part, and my dissent was followed by the opinion of another commission.
So if a submitting organization received funding from the Salvadoran state, would that be a conflict?
From the Salvadorian state?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Maybe, yeah. If we are assessing things concerning El Salvador, maybe yes.
I mean,
is that the problem? Is that in these kind of human rights systems, there is no clarity about what are the rules concerning conflict of interest, and in any case, my vote is always pro-transparency, pro-avoiding conflict of interest.
Right. And were you aware of when I mentioned earlier to Mr. Bullock about President Bukele publicly trying to stigmatize groups like Cristasol? You're aware of that too, right?
Yes, and all of that is being processed in the unit concerning monitoring by the Commission.
Yeah. I'm going to turn this over to Representative Omar, but I just want to again say I've been my first visit to El Salvador was in 1983, and the people of El Salvador have suffered through internal civil conflicts, the terrible war that went on, then the gang violence, poverty, so much, and there's the people are give me great hope. I mean that they deserve better than they've been getting, and I appreciate. We all think the decrease in gang activity is actually an important thing to achieve, but how you get there and what other rights are suspended is important. I mean, I think China can claim that it has low gang activity, right? But when none of us are here to defend the Chinese government's record on human rights, and I was struck, probably more impactfully than I thought, by the conversations I had with people who I've known since the war, with families whose loved ones have been caught up in this state of exception. I mean, who can't even get a confirmation that their loved one is alive, can't visit them. I don't understand like why that is acceptable. And then the other thing that is disturbing is that people are being rounded up where there's no credible evidence that they are involved in gangs or anything or other criminal activities, but they have been critical of the government. Look, I'm in politics. I hate when people are critical of me, right? I mean, we all none of us like to hear criticism, right? But it is what it is. It's part of the business. That's part of a democracy. None of us are universally loved, and to the extent that this state of exception may be being expanded to go after people who are not related to gangs, but people who, quite frankly, have different political opinions or have been critical of the government, that is a serious erosion of democracy. And I think it's important for people, including allies of President Bukele, to kind of call him out on it and to say this is not acceptable. And I'm going to tell you, I don't know what the future holds with the next U.S. president. But one of the things that I heard loud and clear when I was in El Salvador talking to various people and various organizations, some are human rights organizations, some are just social justice or relief organizations. I mean, the World Food Program is not going to go down to El Salvador because hunger is on the rise. There's a challenge with jobs and opportunity. And if the next administration is successful in deporting the people that it all wants to deport, back to El Salvador and other countries, and I don't know where do people go? How do people earn a living? There are some serious things that need to be thought about as we enter into the new administration. But let me now yield to Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman, and really grateful that we are having this hearing today. Mr. Bullock, in 2022, you were named in Citizen Lab investigation as one of dozens to have been victim of surveillance using the software Pegasus. This happened before the state of exception was put in place. Now, I know that the Salvadorian government has denied it was the perpetrator of the surveillance. Personally, I believe that the government must have been the perpetrator. The NSO group, which created Pegasus, has been blacklisted by the United States for its role in facilitating human rights abuses in several countries, including El Salvador. What does the use of Pegasus against you and other civil society members and independent journalists tell us about the Bukele government?
Thank you for that question. In my case, I was informed by Apple that my phone had been infected by the Pegasus software. And the most likely motive was because of who I am and what I do, and that the likely agent that was infecting my, no, not the likely, that the agent infecting my phone was a state-sponsored agent. So I think that your assumptions are probably fair. The only state that would have an interest in doing that would be the Salvadoran state. The impact of that is a bit to what I was mentioning in my comments. The mass arbitrary detention, 83,000 people in almost 3 years, the suspension of due process rights, the knowledge that the Salvadoran government basically can do what it will with whoever it would like, without any independent institutions to protect rights, creates a chilling environment. That they use espionage. In my personal case, it made me feel bad that Salvadoran taxpayers are paying for that, along with other intimidation. When the collaborator that I was mentioning in my comments was detained 2 weeks ago, they said that they were monitoring Crystal Sal's activities in El Salvador. What a terrible use of money. What a terrible use of energy. Everything that they find on my phone, you can find on my personal Facebook or Instagram or in Crystal Sal's. There's no conspiracies in Crystal Sal. So it's used, I think, potentially to criminalize in the future, to find information to attack the legitimacy and image of public human rights defenders. And the impact is felt as a chilling impact across the board. Everybody knows that liking the wrong post, that being critical has a consequence in El Salvador. I would disagree with the statement that there is an absolute freedom of expression. Our report, as I already mentioned, that of over 130 organizations interviewed, 86 of them said we've decided to lower our profile to avoid attacks, to self-censor, to avoid this type of harassment. Everybody knows that this is the entrance fee for exercising rights, for exercising the denouncement of human rights, and that is to the detriment of a democratic society.
In a lot of the testimony, it sounds like most of the conversations around the state of exception. Even if it was lifted today, wouldn't we be naive that the Bukele government could return to democratic and rights-respecting kind of governance? That's to all of you, anybody who wants.
Yeah, as I said in my statement, lifting or revoking the state of exception will not itself make go away all the problems that we've discussed today. And definitely, the state of exception is just one of many measures that the Bukele government has taken to control the institutions and control the population and concentrate power around himself. But definitely, it's lifting the state of exception and looking at the cases of people detained. I think it would be a very important, a very important step. And in some way, if the international pressure makes that happen in dialogue with the government, it would mean that there's still something that we can do, right, to reverse the authoritarian path that is that El Salvador is taking. So it might not mean that everything is going to get better, but I think it's important to go step by step. And one very important step is revoking the state of exception and taking responsibility for reviewing people in jail that is innocent and that is being held incommunicado, which is a very, very basic standard around the world.
I just would like to add something that we haven't discussed today, and is the fact that there is a possibility of a constitutional reform in El Salvador. Bukele has different reforms, not only on the criminal justice system, but also the electoral system. He reduces the number of municipalities, and these reforms were basically a way for him to concentrate power. So to answer your question, I think there is like a blank page there, and it's very uncertain what type of constitutional reforms he will pass. What I mentioned in my testimony, that the fact that the assembly basically just passes any law without any discussion, debate, or public participation is a serious threat for a democratic state. So it's important that the U.S. could engage with the Salvadoran government, including the National Assembly, in order to have more dialogue and openness with citizens, for them know what could be the proposed the constitutional reform proposal. So many of these human rights organizations that will work with, they have raised concerns that maybe Bukele will basically institutionalize all the security measures that were under the state of exception. So it won't be longer needed an exception at a state of exception if this constitutional reform is passed.
Congresswoman, I fully agree with what my colleagues have mentioned. To prevent the abuses from happening, you need due process and judicial independence. And even if you stop the state of emergency, derogate the state of emergency, given the legislation and the situation in El Salvador, there is neither due process or judicial independence. For worse, the Legislative Assembly in El Salvador is reforming Article 248 of the Constitution. This is the article that establishes how the Constitution can be reformed. This reform would mean that the supporters of Bukele in the Legislative Assembly can pass constitutional reforms overnight. Overnight. With a simple vote, they can pass constitutional reforms. This means that there would stop being even the pretend constitution in El Salvador if this reform is passed, because they could reform it in any day.
I know just in your response to that question, many of you have talked about how the United States or the international community can assert some pressure. I'm curious to understand what differences do you all think it makes to have Trump, who is going to be very outwardly supportive of Bukele's governance?
I cannot say how much support will President Trump give to President Bukele, but we are seeing is that President Bukele is already using the presidency of President Trump as a broad support for his authoritarian tendencies. So even if nothing really happens in practice, the idea that President Trump will be here in the executive branch seems to be like really empowering Bukele, and I think it's also important that that whatever is happening in El Salvador should become a bipartisan concern, and I think that the role of the U.S. Congress is now more important than ever, because definitely we're already seeing the effect on the presidency of Trump in President Bukele. And I think it's also important that not just the U.S., but the international community in terms of other Latin American countries and also European countries can come together to reject what the President Bukele is doing.
Mr. Ortega, there's been more than 80,000 detentions in El Salvador since the state of exception was put in place. I want to put that into context for a country like El Salvador size. This is 1% of the population, 1 in every 100 person going to jail. How many of these detentions does your organization believe meet the definition of arbitrary under international standards?
Yeah, we recently submitted a report to the working group of arbitrary detentions, the UN, along with other human rights organizations. We cannot say exactly how many in terms of numbers, because there's not public enough information about every case, but we definitely think that there are most of the detentions could fall under the category of arbitrary detentions because of different reasons. There are grounds according to international law. One is because there are no any kind of previous investigations that can give some kind of legal basis to those detentions. Other is because people is being detained and then their detention is denied by the state and people is held incommunicado. Other category could be because people is detained and there's no any due process guarantees. People is being tortured, and this is not being taken into consideration during the judicial proceedings. So there are several reasons why these detentions could fall under the category of arbitrary detentions.
Mm-hmm. Are there any people who have been detained that you feel like are getting near due process rights?
Are getting near due process?
Yeah.
I know that from the information from some civil society organizations in El Salvador that there's a couple of people that have been released. It's not that they have like the final decision on the case, but they are being, the pretrial detention has been changed by a different kind of arrest in their homes. And I think maybe that's the most, I don't know, the most beneficial measure that the judicial system is taking. But I don't see that in any other case there's anything that we can consider due process guarantees, not even the minimum standards. There are no effective defense. People, as I said, people is being tortured, and in general, definitely there are not judicial guarantees in the cases.
Congresswoman, if I might, I'd like to add to that if I could.
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah, and
voice from
question. Sorry, a voice from above, I imagine. To your last question too about harassment, I just want to add that the online attacks specifically are not felt equally. In our case, in our organization, 3 of 4 online attacks are against our female spokeswomen. They receive 1 insult an hour. I just thought that should be important to say. About due process rights, I mentioned in my testimony the case of Dina Hernandez, who is a human rights defender who has 2 judicial orders for release. She's been, since her 2nd judicial order for release, in prison for 102 days. We also, in November, I accompanied a group of mothers of people detained in the state of exception to a meeting with the United States ambassador, in which they made public their request for family visits and asked the ambassador to support them in his bilateral dialogues with the Salvadoran government, one woman brought 4 judicial orders for the release of her son. They have been not executed by the prison system in El Salvador. The fear of those family members is that they are not alive anymore, and the Salvadoran state is unable to might not be able to produce their loved ones. I mention that because those are examples of due process. When a court does look at a case and they determine that there is a need for alternative measures to pretrial detention, those measures are not being respected by the prison system itself. And it's also important to highlight that when we hear numbers like 7,000 or 8,000 people who have been released, oftentimes those are, at least in the cases that we know, which are hundreds, those are not necessarily people being absolved of crimes. They're being given alternative measures to pretrial detention, which means they have to continue to report to the courts, and they're under constant threat of recapture. When I mentioned the militarizations of communities in the run-ups to the elections or subsequent to the elections, one of the profiles of people that were being detained by soldiers who went door to door with lists and quotas were people who had already been detained and were released with alternative measures to pretrial detention.
Some of you have alluded to people not being alive, possibly forced disappearance. Are you seeing a lot of that?
We have documented multiple cases of enforced disappearances occurring in El Salvador. And let me point to one specific example. And I'm going to name someone who was a top advisor of the Bukele government, Alejandro Mason. And the reason I give his example is because this is a person who was well-connected and close to Bukele, but suddenly criticized Bukele officials. He was arrested on August 9, 2023, died on February 7th, 2024 in prison. He was held incommunicado, forcefully disappeared. He was not allowed to appear even at his own court hearing, where his pretrial detention was established. And the official reasons for his death, we have obtained his medical record, and we have asked forensic experts to analyze his medical record. And these forensic experts have shown that there is no evidence supporting the official allegations for his death. So there are every reason to investigate this case seriously. He died in custody after being forcefully disappeared. And I think this is a case that shows the level of, the lack of protection for anyone in El Salvador. Even people well-connected can end up suffering all sorts of violations. You can imagine what can happen to any ordinary Salvadorian who's being arbitrarily arrested any days in the streets of El Salvador.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have one quick follow-up. For the number of people that are supposedly held, wrongfully detained, the number of people who might have been disappeared and there's no accounting for, the number of people who might have died while in custody and their bodies supposedly have been returned to their families. Are there numbers that are associated with these? In each bracket, do we know, or can we make an assumption of what the numbers look like?
According to different human rights records, in particular Cristosal, there's at least 300 cases of people who had died in prisons, and there are signs that those deaths are not, are intentional and product of torture. And some of these numbers came from an official number that at some point the government acknowledged that there were at least 200 people that had died, but and the Attorney General said that that he was not gonna investigate those cases because they just closed the cases. Mm-hmm. They said that we are natural deaths and nothing criminal around that. But it's important to know that these are numbers coming from civil society groups that are being under attack. and that there's a lot of secrecy around what's happening in prison systems and with people that is detained, so numbers might be way higher than that. This is just a little piece of what civil society organizations can know, and these are based on testimonies that people that is afraid, people that is in exile. So this is just, I think, a small piece of what probably is happening under closed doors.
Yeah. Thank you all for your testimony, for your advocacy. I know that there is probably a lot of danger and scrutiny that you all face, but this work that you're doing is meaningful, and I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to say anything else that you want to say before we close this hearing. But before I do, I just want to say, I mean, this issue about, lack of information or trying to get clarity on exact numbers or on a whole bunch of other issues could easily be resolved, right, if the Salvadoran government wants to work with those who are concerned and be more transparent and forthcoming. This could be done in a way that, that is consistent with some of the concerns that the government may have. But I mean, I have heard concerns expressed to me directly by Salvadorans who have come through Washington or in Massachusetts. But my visit during the weekend of November 16th and some of the meetings we had, I think, intensified my concerns. I mean, again, this is not about whether we believe gang violence should be addressed and people who commit violent crimes should be held to account and prosecuted under the law. I think we're in a different period right now. And as I said in my opening statement, on December 6th, the state of exception was renewed for the 33rd time. 33rd time. So we'll go in the reverse order, Mr. Bernal. We'll begin with you. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say for the record. You had hinted in your opening statement that you thought that the state of exception might be hopefully coming to an end. I don't know whether you have specific information on that or not, but we would appreciate anything you would like to add to the for the record, any perspectives that you have, and we'll just go right through the panel here. So we'll begin with you.
Thank you so much, Chair, for this opportunity. I just want to end with two remarks. The first one is that we in the Commission, we have an open avenue of communication with the state. El Salvador is quite different from other states in the Americas like Nicaragua, Cuba, or Venezuela, who are totally disengaged. They are not responsive. In contrast, El Salvador is fully responsive. As a commissioner, I have sent letters requesting information, for instance, about cases of people who allegedly died in prison or were arrested under conditions of illegality, and the state always replied on time and with full disclosure of information. So I would like to invite any organization who has any information or concern about a particular case, just to direct it to the Commission. I am committed to address the state and to request the information. And my second point is that is maybe one point that hasn't been touched here in this hearing, is that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue, this deliberation, is that as a commissioner, I have witnessed that the gang phenomenon is not a phenomenon from El Salvador, but is a regional phenomenon. So we are having kind of the same problems in at least 3 countries, a little bit in Costa Rica, but also in Guatemala and Honduras, in a country in which everybody knows there is also the state of emergency that has been declared, and they are trying to copy some of the measures that have been taking place in El Salvador. So I would encourage this committee to have a look or to watch this phenomenon as a regional phenomenon. And finally, I don't have a particular private information about the date in which this state of emergency is going to end, but I'm optimistic in nature, and I am pretty sure that once the gangs are under control, the reason for the state of emergency disappear. So what can we hope is that the state of emergency also comes to an end, and then the possibility to have it entrenched for the first time. Democratic constitutionalism in a country like El Salvador can be a reality. I don't think we can talk here about a restoration of a constitutional democracy because before that we had the gangs, and before that we had the war. So it's going to be for the first time that such a phenomenon can happen in this country. And all my hopes are there, and I'm pretty sure that my colleagues here at the Commission are supportive to guarantee the human rights of everyone there in the country. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair.
No, thank you. And just, just one request, again, I thought what was particularly heartbreaking, and I said this before, were families whose loved ones had been apprehended, and they just want confirmation that where they are and that they're alive. And even some, willingness by the government to allow such a confirmation to occur, I think would be helpful. I don't know what I would do if my son or daughter had been taken without charge and I was given no information about why they were taken or where they are. I mean, I'd be out of my mind. And parents are parents, no matter where we live. And that might be at least a somewhat positive step. Mr. Papier?
Chair, thank you. Let me first express our complete support to this recommendation or proposal that there be a mechanism for the relatives of people detained to be able to communicate with them, or at least to know where they're being detained. This is something we heard consistently from relatives of victims we interviewed, and I think it would ease tremendous amount of pain to implement this kind of mechanism. I also agree with your remarks regarding a new phase, regarding renewed concerns about the situation in El Salvador. We are investigating reports of people seemingly being fired because of criticizing the government, being fired from public hospitals or other state-run facilities. This is something we're investigating. And we have seen with lots of concern new laws passed recently, for example, in mid-November, on cybersecurity and data protection, which would allow for further censorship and opacity and restrictions on freedom of expression in El Salvador. So I'm thankful for you to convening this hearing, and I hope that the attention on El Salvador can remain.
Thank you. Ms. Mendez-Dardon?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that we have seen what is happening in El Salvador in other countries such as Nicaragua. There is an authoritarian playbook. Authoritarians have learned what are the tactics and the strategies in order to co-opt the system. So I think it's very important at this point where El Salvador is right now to find the ways that the international community can support civil society. I think it's very important, given all the attacks and harassment that we have discussed today against independent media, civil society organizations, and so on, to find ways to protect them and to provide support, political support, but also financial support for these organizations be able to do their incredible work, particularly defending democracy and human rights in El Salvador.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock?
Again, thank you for the opportunity for this exchange and to share information. I would like to just reinforce the idea the principal problem that we have is not an emergency declaration, it's the lack of independent institutions that can guarantee rights and act as checks on power. And one example related to the questions about forced disappearances is of more than 6,000 habeas corpus claims presented to the Salvadoran Supreme Court, which obviously lacks independence, only 1.38% have been responded to. We're listening to Commissioner Bernal's statements about the state being forthcoming. We assessed 1,463 requests for public information, of which only 27 were responded to at all. So I think it's important to understand that the human rights violations and the democratic setbacks are not the consequence of an emergency decree, rather the erosion of democratic institutions over time that leads Salvadorans to be in a situation in which they find themselves unprotected in front of the repressive power of the state. And so I would maybe end by citing a phrase that comes out of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission reports that this dilemma between rights and security is a false dilemma. In the same sense, the argument that human rights violations, massive and systematic human rights violations that are being perpetrated under the state of exception are in some ways delegitimized or have to be put as weighted against the violence that the gangs perpetrated is part of that false dilemma. It's a false equivalency. The state must protect people against gangs, but it also must protect rights. And at this moment in time in El Salvador, Salvadoran citizens find themselves unprotected against the power of the state. And that is one of the deep concerns that we wanted to highlight today. So thank you very much.
Ms. Arteaga?
Well, I also thank you the opportunity to discuss how the situation in El Salvador is not getting better. Things are getting worse. So at this moment it's critical that the U.S. Congress remains supportive of civil society in El Salvador and also makes more pressure on El Salvador government to try to find ways to resolve not only the situation of people detained during the state of exception, but in a broader sense, issues of democracy. Of course, myself and DPLF remain committed with what we proposed today, and at the same time, I hope that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights keeps also very committed with the situation in El Salvador. I feel that there's an agenda coming from the Inter-American Commission in terms of what's happening in El Salvador. El Salvador needs to comply with the recommendations that came from the report of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I think it's the rapporteur for El Salvador it's a key person to make these recommendations to be compliant, and also I think it's important to have an open communication with El Salvador, but also El Salvador must show that is respecting the Inter-American system, because in the last hearing that we had at the Inter-American Commission that we were discussing this very worrying constitutional reform, the state of El Salvador was invited and didn't show up. So I think that, I don't know, there are like mixed signals, and it's important that El Salvador is compliant with the Inter-American human rights standards, not just through the communication with the rapporteur for El Salvador, but as an institution. And thank you again for all the support.
Well, I want to thank all the panel and my colleagues who showed up here for being part of this hearing. As I said at the beginning, December 10th is Human Rights Day. And so this is an important conversation to have on Human Rights Day. I think all of us believe very strongly that we want El Salvador to succeed. And that goes to the point that Mr. Bullock made, which is that you can have security for the population to protect them from criminal gangs, and you can also respect the rights of every individual in that country. And And again, we will continue to monitor this. And quite frankly, I'll be the first to admit, I think many of us in Congress, because there's so much happening in the world, have kind of taken our eye off of, what's happening in places like El Salvador. And again, El Salvador is a sovereign nation, and we respect the government of El Salvador. But on the same token, those of us who care about human rights, whether we're in the United States or whether we're in El Salvador or anywhere else in the world, we have an obligation to speak out and to try to encourage the powers that be to move in a very different direction. Again, I came away from my trip on the weekend of November 16th more concerned than I have been in a very, very long time. And I hope that things improve for the better. But with that, again, I thank you all for your patience and for your testimonies and for answering the questions. And I wish everybody happy holidays. This hearing is adjourned.